Chapter 2: The Myth of Family Safety. Home is supposed to be the safest place on earth. That is the story every culture tells its children, that love begins at the dinner table, and that blood is thicker than any storm. But stories are not always truths. Sometimes they are spells, comforting illusions that make us look away from what hurts. The comfort of the illusion. I used to repeat the same lines everyone else did: family is everything. Family always has your back. It felt dangerous not to believe it. When people asked how things were at home, I would smile and say, "We're fine." Because if family are not safe, where else could safety exist? That is the first power of the myth: it protects hope. And the second, it protects harm. Behind closed doors, many families survive by pretending. They learn to exchange affection for obedience, silence for peace. A father calls control guidance. A mother calls distance discipline. A child calls loneliness independence. Everyone finds a word that makes the pain sound noble. I found mine: patience. For years I told myself that if I just waited, everyone would come around. But waiting without voice is not patience, it is paralysis. How the myth is created. Society builds the myth of family safety layer by layer. Religion frames the family as sacred. Questioning it feels like sin. Law treats the home as private. Interference feels like trespass. Culture glorifies the good family. Exposure feels like betrayal. Economics depends on families caring for their own. Neglect feels invisible. Each layer reinforces the next until the illusion becomes policy: whatever happens at home is personal. But pain that is personal in origin can still be public in consequence. When exclusion, silence, and emotional starvation are left untreated, they ripple outward, shaping mental health, productivity, and social trust. What begins as a closed door ends as a closed heart. A memory of contained chaos. One evening, years before I found recovery, I came home to the sound of laughter. Family dinner was in progress. I lingered at the hallway, unsure if I was welcome. When I finally stepped inside, the conversation paused, not out of malice, just discomfort. Someone asked about work, someone changed the subject. Within minutes the room was full again, only without me in it. That moment was not dramatic. No argument. No cruelty. Just a small shift in air pressure that said, "We do not know where to put you." I ate quickly and left. The silence followed me to bed, wrapping around like a second blanket. The next morning, I could not eat at all. That is how domestic discrimination hides inside ordinary moments that no one remembers but you. And because it leaves no visible wound, you start doubting your own reality. The myth's double logic. The family myth works by contradiction. Family always loves you. Therefore, if you feel unloved, something must be wrong with you. Family keeps you safe. Therefore, if you feel unsafe, you must be dramatic. Family forgives everything. Therefore, if you are not forgiven, you must be unforgivable. It is emotional algebra that always ends with self-blame. In clinical language, this dynamic is called gaslighting. In spiritual language, it is false faith. In my language, it is psychological atrophy, the steady loss of confidence in your own perception. Every time the environment denies your truth, your internal muscles for self-trust weaken. Eventually, you stop asking for care because you have learned that honesty brings exile. Why we protect the myth. People defend the myth for two main reasons: fear and shame. Fear because dismantling it means facing the fragility of our own memories. Shame because we would have to admit that love can coexist with neglect. It is easier to call harm normal than to call it real. That is why families, institutions, and even nations cling to denial. It preserves the image of goodness. But the cost of that denial is enormous. Every silenced story becomes another case study in psychological atrophy, the quiet draining of human potential. When belonging is conditional, courage disappears. When empathy is punished, conscience withers. And when whole generations grow up confusing love with fear, society loses its moral immune system. A broader lens. Anthropologists call the family a microsociety, the first government, first school, first church we ever know. If that microsociety rewards hierarchy over honesty, it trains citizens to accept corruption as culture. If it rewards silence over compassion, it breeds leaders who confuse control with order. This is how domestic discrimination scales up to national dysfunction. The habits we learn at home, exclusion, favoritism, selective empathy, become the habits of our institutions. So, the myth of family safety is not harmless nostalgia. It is the operating manual for inequality. Breaking the spell. Healing begins when one person decides to tell the truth out loud. Not to accuse, but to identifying. To say, my home was not safe for me, but I still believe safety is possible. When I first said those words, they tasted like betrayal. But within them was freedom, the freedom to see clearly without hating blindly. Clarity does not destroy love, it refines it. It turns blind loyalty into conscious compassion. That is what dismantling the myth really means, replacing denial with discernment. You can still love your family and acknowledge its harm. You can seek belonging without surrendering your sanity. The science of seeing clearly. Psychologists studying moral injury, the trauma of witnessing or participating in harm, find that truth-telling restores cognitive integrity. The brain realigns when our stories match our sensations. That is why confession, therapy, or even honest conversation can feel physically relieving. The body no longer has to perform contradiction. For survivors of domestic discrimination, this alignment is the first step out of psychological atrophy. It reactivates the neural pathways of self-trust and connection. It is the mental equivalent of stretching a limb long left immobile. Every "I see it now" moment is rehabilitation. What real safety looks like. Real safety isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of respect, repair, and choice. In a safe family, mistakes invite dialogue, not punishment. Boundaries protect, not isolate. Love adapts to truth instead of demanding silence. When we practice those principles in our homes, we create the emotional architecture of justice. The same muscles that make a household humane make a nation ethical. That's the paradox of the myth. Once we admit family isn't automatically safe, we finally have the chance to make it safe for real. Closing reflection. The myth of family safety once gave me comfort. Now it gives me clarity. Because I see what it hid: a whole generation of people mistaking endurance for love. If we want to end poverty, crime, and corruption, we must start where those patterns begin, in the emotional economies of our homes. Until we build safety on honesty instead of appearance, society will keep inheriting the same unfinished business. The next chapter examines how that inheritance operates, the anatomy of domestic discrimination, and how ordinary acts of silence accumulate into systemic harm. Understanding the mechanics of that atrophy is the first step toward stopping it. End of Chapter 2, The Myth of Family Safety. Chapter 3, The Birth of Psychological Atrophy.